Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of guy who believed his size gave him the right to push people around. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with broad shoulders and arms covered in cheap tattoos, he walked through life like he owned every street corner. At 28 years old, Marcus had built his reputation on fear and intimidation in his rough neighborhood of East London. That Tuesday morning started like any other for Marcus. He rolled out of bed in his cramped apartment, the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke clinging to everything he owned. His knuckles were still bruised from the weekend when he had cornered some college kid outside a pub and taken his wallet. Easy money, he thought to himself while pulling on his worn leather jacket. Marcus had dropped out of school at 16, never holding down a job for more than a few months. He made his living through petty crime, intimidation, and the occasional underground fight where desperate men bet their last pounds on bloody entertainment. His face bore the scars of countless street fights, a crooked nose that had been broken 3 times, and eyes that seemed to challenge everyone he met. The morning was unusually bright for London, with golden sunlight cutting through the typical gray clouds. Marcus decided to take a walk through the city center, looking for easy targets among the tourists and office workers. He had learned over the years that well-dressed people often carried more cash and were less likely to fight back. As he wandered through the busy streets, Marcus noticed the crowds were thicker than usual. Street vendors were setting up their stalls earlier, and there seemed to be an excited energy in the air that he couldn't quite understand. Police officers were positioned at various corners, their radios crackling with constant communication. Near Trafalgar Square, Marcus spotted a group of tourists taking pictures. They were clearly Americans, wearing bright clothing and expensive cameras hanging around their necks. Perfect targets, he thought. But as he approached them, he noticed something that made him pause. There were more police around than usual, and some of them weren't regular officers. Among the crowd, Marcus saw a man who immediately caught his attention for all the wrong reasons. The man was tall, probably in his early 30s, with perfectly pressed uniform and polished boots that reflected the morning sun. His posture was unnaturally straight, shoulders back, chin up, like someone had placed a steel rod down his spine. What annoyed Marcus most was the man's composure. While everyone else in the crowd was chatting, laughing, or looking around nervously, this man stood perfectly still. His eyes moved constantly, but his body remained motionless, like a statue that had learned to breathe. There was something about his presence that made the space around him feel different, more serious. The man wore a distinctive uniform that Marcus didn't recognize at first. It was dark blue with gold buttons and trim, incredibly clean and fitted perfectly to his athletic frame. On his head sat a tall hat with a gold badge that caught the light every time he turned his head slightly to scan the crowd. Marcus felt his usual anger rising in his chest. He hated people who looked too clean, too proper, too much like they thought they were better than him. This guy, with his fancy uniform and perfect posture, represented everything that Marcus had been fighting against his entire life. Rich people, authority figures, anyone who looked down on him from their high positions. The bully began moving closer, his hands already clenched into fists. He had developed a technique over the years for picking fights with people who looked like they wouldn't fight back. Start with verbal harassment, escalate to physical intimidation, and if they still didn't back down, throw the first punch hard and fast. As Marcus got within 10 feet of the uniformed man, he realized that several other people in the crowd were watching the situation develop. Some tourists had their phones out, probably hoping to capture some authentic London street drama. A few locals seemed to recognize what was about to happen and were already moving away from the area. Marcus stopped about 5 feet away from the man and cleared his throat loudly. The uniformed man's eyes shifted slightly to acknowledge Marcus's presence, but his body position didn't change at all. This lack of reaction only made Marcus angrier. "Nice outfit, fancy boy," Marcus said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You heading to some costume party or something?" The man didn't respond, which Marcus took as a sign of weakness. In his experience, people who didn't immediately respond to his verbal challenges were usually too scared to defend themselves. He took another step closer, now close enough to smell the man's cologne, which only added to his irritation. "I'm talking to you, pretty boy," Marcus continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "You think you're too good to answer me? You think that fancy uniform makes you special?" Still no response. The man's breathing remained perfectly steady, his eyes continuing to scan the crowd as if Marcus wasn't even there. This was the final insult that Marcus couldn't tolerate. In his world, being ignored was worse than being insulted. Marcus had no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't know that the man he was harassing was not just wearing a costume or some fancy security guard uniform. He had no understanding of the years of training, discipline, and combat experience that stood before him in that perfectly pressed uniform. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. Phones were being raised to capture whatever was coming next. The other police officers in the area had noticed the situation, but hadn't moved to intervene yet, perhaps curious to see how their colleague would handle the situation. Marcus rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles, an intimidation ritual he had perfected over years of street fights. He was confident in his ability to handle any soft-looking guy in a fancy uniform. After all, he had been fighting his whole life, while this guy probably spent his days standing around looking pretty for tourists. The uniformed man finally turned his full attention to Marcus for the first time. When their eyes met, Marcus felt a small chill run down his spine, though he quickly pushed the feeling away. There was something in the man's gaze that suggested depths of experience that Marcus couldn't begin to understand. But Marcus was too committed now, too angry, and too proud to back down. The crowd was watching, his reputation was on the line, and he had never walked away from a fight in his life. He took one final step forward, close enough now that he could have reached out and grabbed the man's uniform. What Marcus didn't realize was that he wasn't facing just any security guard or police officer. The man standing before him was a member of one of the most elite military units in the world, trained not just in combat, but in protection, discipline, and split-second decision-making under pressure. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be over almost before it began, but would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Marcus decided he had waited long enough for a response. His face was red with anger and embarrassment at being ignored by someone he saw as just another stuck-up authority figure. The crowd around them had grown to about 30 people, all sensing that something explosive was about to happen. "You deaf or just stupid?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the nearby buildings. Spit flew from his mouth as he spoke, landing on the pristine uniform of the man before him. "I asked you a question, you pompous piece of trash!" The uniformed man finally spoke, his voice calm and controlled despite the aggressive behavior directed at him. "Sir, I need you to step back and move along. You're creating a disturbance in a public area." His accent was crisp and educated, the kind that Marcus had learned to hate during his rough upbringing. It reminded him of every teacher who had looked down on him, every boss who had fired him, every person who had made him feel small and worthless throughout his life. "Oh, listen to this guy!" Marcus laughed loudly, turning to address the crowd like a performer on stage. "Sir, I need you to step back," he mocked in an exaggerated, posh accent. "Who do you think you are? The bloody queen herself." A few people in the crowd chuckled nervously, but most remained silent, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond simple street theater. Some of the tourists began backing away while others held their phones higher to get better video angles of whatever was about to unfold. Marcus turned back to face the guard, his chest puffed out and his fists clenched tighter. "Let me tell you something, fancy boy. I don't take orders from anyone. especially not from some toy soldier playing dress-up for tourists. The guard's expression remained completely neutral, but those watching closely might have noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. His posture, somehow, became even more rigid and controlled. Years of training had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond proportionally, but also to give every situation a chance to de-escalate naturally. "This is your final warning," the guard said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "Step away now or face the consequences of your actions." Marcus threw back his head and laughed, a harsh sound that made several nearby children move closer to their parents. "Consequences? What are you going to do, arrest me? I don't see any handcuffs on that pretty uniform of yours." What Marcus failed to notice was that several other uniformed figures had begun moving closer to their position. They weren't rushing or making obvious movements, but they were definitely repositioning themselves around the growing crowd. The local police officers had also taken notice and were watching carefully, though they seemed content to let the situation play out for now. "I'll tell you what your consequences are going to be," Marcus continued, now pointing an aggressive finger directly at the guard's chest. "You're going to apologize to me for being a stuck-up piece of garbage, and then you're going to get out of my sight before I decide to mess up that pretty face of yours." The guard's response was to simply stand straighter, if that was even possible. His hands remained at his sides, but Marcus was too angry and too focused on his own aggression to notice the subtle way the man's weight had shifted to the balls of his feet. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus said, taking another step closer until he was almost nose to nose with the guard. "You think that uniform makes you special. You think it makes people respect you. Well, let me show you what I think of your fancy costume." Without any further warning, Marcus reached out and grabbed the front of the guard's uniform jacket with his left hand. His plan was to pull the man forward and throw a devastating right hook to his jaw, a combination that had ended dozens of fights in Marcus's favor over the years. But the moment Marcus's fingers touched the fabric of that uniform, he had crossed a line that he didn't even know existed. He wasn't just assaulting some random security guard or police officer. He was attacking a member of the Royal Guard, a soldier sworn to protect the crown and trained to respond to threats with precise and overwhelming force. The guard's reaction was instantaneous and professional. Instead of allowing himself to be pulled forward, he stepped slightly to his left while simultaneously grabbing Marcus's wrist with both hands. The movement was so smooth and quick that most of the crowd didn't even see it happen. Marcus found himself off balance, his own forward momentum working against him as the guard used a basic but effective joint control technique. The pain in his wrist was immediate and intense, causing him to release his grip on the uniform instantly. "You're making a serious mistake," the guard said calmly, his voice showing no sign of strain despite the physical confrontation. "Release me now and walk away." But Marcus was too far gone in his rage to think clearly. The pain in his wrist only made him angrier, and the fact that this pretty boy had actually fought back was an insult he couldn't tolerate. Using his free hand, he swung wildly at the guard's head, putting all his weight and fury behind the punch. This was the moment everything changed. The guard released Marcus's wrist and took a small step backward, causing the wild punch to miss completely. Marcus stumbled forward, thrown off balance by his own missed swing, and found himself in the worst possible position for what was about to happen next. The guard's response was not the wild brawling that Marcus was used to from street fights. It was precise, calculated, and devastatingly effective. In one fluid motion, he pivoted on his left foot while bringing his right fist up in a perfect uppercut that caught Marcus directly on the chin. The impact was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The guard's years of training, combined with perfect technique and timing, delivered a blow that lifted Marcus completely off his feet. For a brief moment that seemed to last forever, the bully hung in the air, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The crowd gasped as one, phones capturing every second of Marcus's flight through the air. Time seemed to slow down as his body began its inevitable descent back toward the concrete sidewalk. The arrogant sneer that had been permanently fixed on his face was replaced by an expression of complete bewilderment. When Marcus finally hit the ground, the sound echoed through the square like a gunshot. His head bounced once off the concrete before he lay still, his eyes rolled back and showing only white. A small pool of blood began forming near his mouth, mixed with what appeared to be several of his front teeth. The guard immediately returned to his original position, his uniform barely wrinkled from the brief encounter. His breathing remained steady, his posture perfect, as if nothing had happened at all. The only evidence of the confrontation was the unconscious man lying at his feet and the stunned silence that had fallen over the entire crowd. The whole incident, from first contact to final impact, had lasted less than 10 seconds. The silence that followed the knockout punch seemed to stretch on forever, though it probably lasted only a few seconds. The crowd stood frozen, their phones still recording as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Marcus lay motionless on the concrete, his body twisted at an awkward angle, blood slowly pooling beneath his head. The guard remained perfectly still, his eyes now scanning the crowd with professional alertness. His training had taught him that, after any physical altercation, there could be additional threats from friends of the aggressor or simply from people who might misunderstand what had happened. But as he looked around, he saw only shocked faces and impressed nods from those who had witnessed the entire encounter. Within moments, the other members of the Royal Guard who had been positioning themselves around the area moved in with practiced efficiency. They formed a protective circle around their colleague and the unconscious Marcus, while simultaneously directing the crowd to give them space to work. One of the guards immediately knelt beside Marcus to check his condition. Despite being knocked unconscious, the bully was breathing steadily, though blood continued to trickle from his mouth where his teeth had been loosened by the impact. The guard checking him had medical training, as all members of the unit did, and quickly determined that while Marcus would have a severe concussion and dental damage, he was not in immediate danger. The local police officers who had been observing from a distance now approached the scene. The lead officer, a veteran sergeant named Williams, had seen the entire confrontation unfold and knew exactly what had happened. He had also recognized the uniforms of the Royal Guard and understood the significance of what the bully had attempted to do. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Sergeant Williams said respectfully to the guards. "I witnessed the entire incident. The civilian initiated physical contact and threw the first punch. Your response was completely justified and proportional." The guard who had delivered the knockout punch nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. His training emphasized letting proper authorities handle the aftermath of any incident while maintaining professional composure at all times. As word spread through the crowd about what had actually happened, the mood began to shift dramatically. The tourists, who had initially been shocked by the violence, were now taking pictures with the guards and asking questions about their uniforms and duties. Many of them had never seen Royal Guards outside of Buckingham Palace and were fascinated by their professionalism and skill. "Did you see how fast that was?" one American tourist said excitedly to her companion. "That guy didn't know what hit him." "I got it all on video," replied her friend, already uploading the footage to social media. "This is going to go viral for sure." Meanwhile, an ambulance had been called for Marcus, though he was starting to show signs of regaining consciousness. His eyes fluttered open and closed as he tried to focus on his surroundings. When he attempted to speak, he discovered that several of his front teeth were loose or missing entirely, causing him to speak with a painful lisp. What happened?" Marcus mumbled through his damaged mouth, tasting blood and feeling sharp pain every time he tried to move his jaw. Sergeant Williams knelt down beside him with a notepad in hand. "You're under arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard," he said officially. "You have the right to remain silent, though I'd recommend it given the state of your mouth." As the reality of his situation began to sink in, Marcus tried to sit up, but was immediately overcome by dizziness and nausea. The concussion was severe enough that he couldn't maintain his balance, forcing him to lie back down on the concrete while waiting for medical attention. The crowd had grown even larger as news of the incident spread through social media. Videos of the knockout punch were already being shared thousands of times, with comments pouring in from around the world. Most viewers were expressing satisfaction at seeing a bully get his comeuppance, especially one who had been foolish enough to attack a member of the Royal Guard. One video, taken by a teenager with a particularly good angle, showed the entire sequence in slow motion. Viewers could see Marcus's confident swagger as he approached the guard, his aggressive posturing and verbal abuse the moment he grabbed the uniform, and then the lightning-fast response that sent him flying through the air. The contrast between his arrogance before the punch and his helplessness afterward was striking. As the ambulance arrived and paramedics began treating Marcus, Sergeant Williams interviewed several witnesses to get their statements about what had occurred. Every single person who had seen the incident told the same story. Marcus had been the aggressor from start to finish, while the guard had shown remarkable restraint before finally defending himself. "That young man in uniform was a perfect gentleman," said an elderly woman who had been feeding pigeons nearby when the confrontation began. "He gave that horrible bully every chance to walk away. What happened to him was exactly what he deserved." The paramedics confirmed that Marcus had suffered a severe concussion, multiple loose teeth, and a fractured jaw. He would need surgery to repair the damage and would be dealing with the consequences of his actions for months to come. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, he was still mumbling incoherently about fancy uniforms and pretty boys, apparently not yet understanding the magnitude of his mistake. The guard who had defended himself was surrounded by his colleagues for a brief debriefing. Standard protocol required that any physical altercation involving a member of the Royal Guard be thoroughly documented and reviewed, even when the guard's actions were clearly justified. "Textbook response," commented the senior guard present. "Minimal force, maximum effectiveness." The training worked exactly as designed. As news crews began arriving at the scene, drawn by the viral videos already circulating online, the guards prepared to return to their regular duties. They had no interest in becoming celebrities or giving interviews about the incident. Their job was to serve and protect, not to seek publicity for doing their duty. The aftermath of the confrontation would follow Marcus for years to come. The criminal charges against him would result in a substantial fine and community service, but the real consequence was the permanent damage to his reputation. The video of his knockout became one of the most watched justice videos on the internet, with millions of people around the world seeing him get exactly what he deserved. Local residents in his neighborhood, who had lived in fear of his bullying for years, finally felt safe enough to report his previous crimes to police. Without his intimidating presence on the streets, witnesses came forward with stories of robberies, assaults, and threats that Marcus had committed over the years. The Royal Guard, meanwhile, received commendations for their professionalism and restraint throughout the incident. The guard who had delivered the knockout punch was particularly praised for giving Marcus multiple opportunities to de-escalate before using force, and for using exactly the right amount of force to end the threat without causing permanent injury. As the crowd finally began to disperse and normal life returned to the square, one thing was clear to everyone who had witnessed the events: actions have consequences. And sometimes those consequences come delivered by someone with perfect technique and years of training. Marcus had learned the hardest possible lesson about respect, authority, and the dangers of underestimating the person standing in front of you. The viral videos of his humiliation would serve as a warning to other potential bullies around the world. Some people may look like easy targets, but appearances can be deceiving, and Royal Guards are definitely not people you want to mess with.